What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Dark Crisis. Now, here's the thing. The conclusion of this story is going to give us a pretty huge jaw-dropping moment, and I'm entirely excited to see how it is you guys respond to it. But what this does is this picks up off the heels of the last video that we did. So as always, if you guys want to get caught up, or if you're new here, make sure you check out the playlist down in the description that'll get you caught up on everything. But the long and short of this is that, again, Pariah, up until about the last issue, had been the main villain of the story. That the idea was that Pariah was using the Great Darkness, which was just really this kind of enigmatic force that exists in DC Comics, that really up until this story and the old Swamp Thing story from the original Crisis on Infinite Earth stories, we didn't really know a whole lot about it. It was just kind of the antithesis of the Presence or God. So if you want to apply like morality to this, the Presence represents absolute good and the Great Darkness represents absolute evil, but not really, because one of the things that we've learned is the Great Darkness isn't really an evil being. It just represents the absence of anything, right? Just the end of all things is more or less what it is. But Pariah was using his power in order to bring back the original multiverse that was destroyed during the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, where Pariah has been defeated here, the Great Darkness's power was passed to Deathstroke. Now, it's kind of an interesting choice as to why this was done by Joshua Williamson. I'm not entirely sure. This could have happened with virtually anybody, and it would have just made good sense. Now, the funny thing about this is that while this battle is going on, we actually get this commentary from seemingly Deathstroke himself, where he says, "You said it yourself, Richards, the darkness never goes away." Well, really, Richard, he's talking about Dick Grayson, Richard Grayson, that kind of thing. But he says, you can light some pretty candles and make all the hopeful speeches that you want, but in the end, the light always prevails. It's all we're left with. It's the only true legacy. Pariah was a certifiable loon. Thought he was talking to some great darkness when it was really just the voices in his head until he bit the dust. But the darkness he created lives on, and it's got you too, pulling you backward, stripping you of all that you've become. But unlike Pariah, you are not alone. Now, here's the funny thing about this, right? Like, here's the interesting thing about this. This runs in stark contrast. I know it's going to sound a little strange to kind of pull this out of the hat, but it runs in stark contrast to like Superboy Prime. And the reason why is because in a lot of ways, if you break them down on the character level, Dick Grayson and Superboy Prime were opposites, but similar at the same time. The idea of Dick Grayson is that he was the first Robin, right? And so from a publishing side in DC Comics, when they were releasing stories, he was like the young kid who wanted to be Batman's sidekick, and it worked really, really well, right? I mean, comics sold like gangbusters. But within the comic book landscape itself, Dick Grayson as Robin brought a kind of youthful vibrance to DC Comics that it didn't really have at the time, right? Being able to see the world through the eyes of a child. And so over the course of his character's really publication history in DC, while he has had good times and bad times, and he's had some really, really bad times, that kind of light to the world never really went away. It always kind of stayed there. And that's the reason why, in a lot of ways, Dick Grayson is seen in DC Comics as the best of all the superheroes. Because no matter how bad things get, and as a superhero who operates in Bloodhaven, which is arguably worse than Gotham City, that he always maintains that measure of happiness, that exuberance, that the day can be saved, that hope is not lost no matter how hard the enemy tries, that if they hold out the good fight, they can always come out on top. In stark contrast to this, Superboy Prime was a character who believed that the age of the anti-heroes, Batman kind of toting the line between the good guy and the bad guy, even Superman to a degree doing that superheroes had quote-unquote lost their purpose. They weren't heroes anymore. They were just bad guys masquerading as heroes and then occasionally doing good things. But these characters are complete opposites, but very similar in that way. I draw that parallel because in a lot of ways, what you're seeing with Slade here is very reminiscent of Superboy Prime. It's very reminiscent of the old, like, Superboy Prime stories from Infinite Crisis and really kind of the aftermath going into like Sinestro Corps War and the Green Lantern comics by Jeff Johns, in the sense that Slade Wilson is very much cynical here, and to a degree a narcissist, and you would even argue a nihilist, depending on how you want to look at it here. But the thing about it is he tells Dick Grayson, while Dick Grayson's kind of trapped in the darkness, Slade Wilson literally tells him, look at everything going on out there, right? The superheroes are throwing everything at me but the kitchen sink. But at the end of the day, they're not going to be able to hold the line. And the reason why is because they are dark, right? Because they do fight off that dark part of themselves, but they're not you, Dick Grayson. And if I can conquer you, right? If the Great Darkness can ensnare and take over you, what chance do any of these guys have? Now, the funny thing about this is he says, it's like the rest of our lives, pointless. Even if I kick the bucket out there, the darkness will find a new home. nothing can stop it. And so when Dick Grayson asks, why did you do this? It's so unlike you, which is true, it is. It's not really in the character of Slade Wilson to allow himself to fall prey to something like this, but Dick Grayson asks, how much of this is you and how much was Pariah's control? He says at the start, it was Pariah. It was Pariah manipulating me, whispering words in my head, just kind of tricking me and so on and so forth. He says, but he made a good argument. Our world needs to die. And he says, I've seen this world hurt my children too many times. And the funny thing about this is that it looks like from what Slade Wilson's saying that he's actually hiding behind really like the world itself in order to avoid the consequences of his own actions, right? It's him literally saying like, the world has hurt my children. The world's done terrible things to my children. And that's where Slade's at the moment, right? At this moment right now, it's easier to simply just avoid the fact that the guy was a terrible dad and the guy did terrible things to his kids and put them in harm's way and even tried to kill them on a couple of occasions, right? Now he does kind of admit to a degree, right? Like, I was the one that brought that hurt into their lives. But again, he's not really coming clean and admitting fault here. It's more or less him saying, yeah, I brought the hurt into their lives, but if it wasn't for the world, that hurt wouldn't exist in the first place. So the world has to go away. The world has to end. It's all got to go away. It's all got to end. As you have this fight kind of breaking out, you do have some heroes who sort of pop up. Damian Wayne shows up with like Justice Incarnate, different things along those lines, but he also ends up bringing in Dr. Light. So here's something to understand when it comes to Dr. Light. In the old days in DC Comics, Dr. Light was a person who could manipulate light, and there were a few other things that could go with it. During Dark Crisis, Dark Army, that tie-in with Damian Wayne and all them, one of the things that we learn is that Dr. Light was actually gifted with the ability to tap into the source, right? The energy of all creation. Now, that's an astronomical power boost, right? It's like being able to tap in, for those of you guys coming from Marvel Comics, it's like being able to tap into the power of the one above all, right? It's just a ridiculous source of energy that a person can use. Although DC's use of the source is a lot more tamed down than the kind of flights of fantasy that you see in Marvel Comics when it comes to like insane levels of power, like the one above all or the Beyonders or the Living Tribunal or something along those lines. But the important thing here is that being able to tap into the source also means being able to manipulate the entire basis behind the multiverse itself. And so given what's said here, and this is something that's really, really important, right? Damian says, I uncovered that Dr. Light is connected to the multiverse the same way Pariah was to the darkness. And so in turn, Dr. Light says, I absorbed the light that created the multiverse, and I believe I can use it to illuminate the darkness. What we're talking about here are avatars, and not that dissimilar avatars when it comes to Pariah and Dr. Light. If Pariah was a guy who could tap into the power of the Great Darkness and use the power of the Great Darkness for its own end, the source is kind of the antithesis, the opposite of the Great Darkness. And so Dr. Light being able to tap into the source means she can tap into the light of creation, so she can effectively undo what Pariah had done. The difference here is that Pariah is far more adept at being able to navigate and manipulate the multiverse because he's been around for so long and because his history is irrevocably tied to the multiverse itself. For Pariah, navigating the multiverse is his first language. For Dr. Light, she's still learning the basics, right? She's still learning like simple forms of communication. Hello, how are you doing? That kind of thing. Now, the reality is that given everything that's going on, and before the Justice League was even aware of the fact that Dr. Light was tied to the multiverse, they sent the various flashes into the multiverse itself in order to try to find some way to free the multiverse of the darkness's control. Because remember, the darkness is still permeating out there in the multiverse. It's still doing its thing. It's become less of a focus because now we're more focused on what's happening on Earth, but that's still going on there. Now, there isn't a whole lot they can do here. They can move through the multiverse, but they need an extra source of power. Dr. Light, realizing this, travels to meet with the speedsters. Now, at that point, you switch over to what's arguably the best moment in the comic, and it's really cool the way that it happened. So what you end up doing is you actually pick up with Black Adam facing off against Deathstroke. Now, the fight between Black Adam and Slade is really cool because while all this is going on, you have Mr. Terrific who kind of says, we still need a way to stop Slade and the Dark Army. And that's where Black Adam comes in. He's like, that is my sacrifice to make. And he says, Darkseid warned me that I was the key to defeating you. I should have seen it. But there is much that I've been blind to. Even after I dismissed the heroes, they still saved me when I betrayed them. I thought that only I had the will and the power to stop the darkness, but I was right, and that is why my name is Black Adam. And in doing so, and this is kind of something we have to talk about here for a second, in doing so, he gives the entirety of the Justice League and really the larger superhero community as powers. Literally, they all are able to tap into the power of Black Adam, which is kind of nuts, right? Like, Black Adam takes over the Justice League, or the Justice League all become Black Adams. However you want to slice it, they're all able to tap into his abilities. Now, the thing about this and the way the Black Adam's being handled here, this is completely ignoring basically Jeff Johns' run on Shazam in the Seven Magic Lands. And the reason why is because at the end of that story, Black Adam joined the Shazam family. He was a tried and true good guy. He turned it all around, right? This story and basically the way Black Adam's handled here ignores all of that. And that's why those of us who are reading this story, who are basically DC comic fans, or at least have read DC comics enough to understand a reboot when it happens, are all looking at this and saying, this is a reboot, right? Because what it's doing is it's basically writing out elements of storylines that have either happened recently or are currently happening now. But the important thing here, kind of leaving that bit aside, the important thing here is that the entirety of the Justice League, now united under the power of Black Adam, that power bolsters their own. So it's like Superman combined with the powers of Black Adam, Green Lanterns combined with the powers of Black Adam. I also just kind of want to throw this out here. Superman and Batman look nuts. It is amazing. But this is where you get to the beauty of the other part of the situation. You have this kind of conversation that goes on between Slade Wilson and Nightwing himself, that this kind of takes place simultaneously with the attempt of the Great Darkness to overtake everything, specifically to overtake Nightwing. Now, that's the significance of all of this, is because while Dr. Light is able to combine her powers with those of the Speedsters and then basically push the Great Darkness back to its original resting place, right? Basically saving the multiverse. What this does is it takes the new multiverse, or kind of the old multiverse from before Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it combines it with the new multiverse that was created in the aftermath of Final Crisis, really Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, and the New 52. So what DC has effectively done here, if I'm reading this correctly, what they've done here is they've combined multiverses. They brought back the original multiverse and they combined it with the new multiverse. Basically, it's a kind of unification. Everything that ever existed before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths exists again, and it exists alongside the main DC universe as we've been viewing it since Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, and the New 52 in 2011. That means the old school Earth 2 Superman exists now. That guy is presumably back. Hopefully we'll get a chance to explore all that stuff, but I'm not entirely sure. Again, only time will tell in terms of what all this means. But the bigger thing here is the fight between Slade and Black Adam is amazing, because what Slade says is, I'm surprised at you, Black Adam, and he says, you know as well as I do, these new kids are not worth our time, right? These new superheroes who are running around out here, who are taking on kind of the mantle of their proteges, why would you fight alongside all of them? Why would you protect them? And the response of Black Adam is, I would die with them. Now, this is exceedingly important, and the reason why is because for someone like Black Adam, he's been around for a long time. His main enemy is Shazam, but he's fought Superman, he's fought Batman, he's basically run the gamut of pretty much every superhero who exists out there. There's really nobody in DC Comics better suited to offer an actual concrete analysis of whether or not any of these young heroes are worth the time and effort of basically teaching or training or anything like that. But Dick Grayson, and it's kind of an interesting way they put it here, Dick Grayson is not Batman. He was never Batman. He was a Robin and eventually became his own superhero. But the reality here is he was the first in a new generation of heroes who followed after their mentors. And so that's why you have Slade kind of referring to Dick Grayson to a degree as like a poor man's Batman. That's why you have him asking the question, why would you fight alongside all these younger heroes? But the funny thing about this is that Dick Grayson says, Bruce wouldn't fight the dark, right? I must let the darkness in. I must take it on myself, and seemingly is succumb by the darkness. But that's where you have Dick Grayson, who kind of dispels this perception of the different superheroes who exist out there, right? The Slade says, touching, it appears the multiverse gets to live another day, Black Adam, but we must stop the children from following in our footsteps. Now again, while Slade's not directly having this conversation with Dick Grayson can hear it all. And that's when Dick Grayson says, you'll never get it, Slade. We're not following in anyone's footsteps. All of us walk together. No matter the world or generation, we embrace our history alongside the new to bring hope to everyone. Now, this is an exceedingly important point that Joshua Williamson is making here. Because what Joshua Williamson is really saying here is that for a lot of people out there, they would look at like Dick Grayson, they would say, he's not Batman. Well, no, of course he's not. He never was. He was started out as Robin, and then he became like Nightwing. He kind of operated as Batman for a little while, but was never designed to be a replacement of Batman. That what Dick Grayson is doing, really Joshua Williamson by way of Dick Grayson, is kind of countering this point of people who say, I don't want things to change. I want comics to stay the same forever, right? It's one of those things where that doesn't happen. The reality here is that Dick Grayson, sure, is not a Batman, and he never was. That none of these heroes, these younger heroes, Jonathan Kent, for example, kind of operating as Superboy, they're not looking to like copy or replace any of those existing heroes. They're carving out their own niche. Now, that is a clear and obvious point that DC's made over and over again. The only people who don't grasp that are the ones who choose not to, for whatever reason that makes sense to themselves. But the bigger point here is that none of these heroes are looking to walk in the footsteps of anybody. They're carving out their own niche. They're becoming their own heroes, stepping into their own roles. And it's a really, really interesting point to make here, because there have kind of been instances in the past when DC Comics has tried to take a younger hero and replace an older hero with that younger hero. What Joshua Williamson is doing here is clean slating all of that. Again, it's DC picking and choosing what they want to keep in order to kind of balance out the scales and make sure that the comic line is the most interesting to the largest number of people. But it's one of those interesting concepts, because what you have is Slade, who again tries to go after like Dick Grayson, and then his daughter jumps in the way and says, stop, right? Like, this is over. The Great Darkness is done. It doesn't have its control over you anymore. It's pushed back to its place. The multiverse is saved. What are you fighting for? Right? Like, what are you fighting for? Like, if your fight here really is this idea that you are afraid that the world is such a terrible and horrible place that you want to destroy it in order to save us from it, then what kind of sense does that make? Right? That's nonsensical. The world's a bad place, so we have to wipe out the world. Well, here's an option, Slade. Why not just make the world better? Like, why not just do that? Right? Why not just make the world a better place? And so Slade, kind of realizing this to a degree, actually backs down, and the fight more or less comes to an end. Now, this is where things get really interesting and really intriguing here, because for the most part, it's DC setting everything back to the status quo, right? Families reunited. So you have Damian Wayne, who's back with Batman. The heroes who started it all have returned. The Justice Society of America is back in full swing. The Teen Titans are back at Titan Tower. The Dr. Light does explore her new powers and her new abilities, so finally, for the first time in years, Dr. Light has a purpose in DC Comics, right? Justice League Incarnate still exists out there in the multiverse. They still do their thing. The quintessence has been restored, so these ultra-powerful beings who kind of help to guide and keep an eye on everything that's progressing. Darkseid's return to Apocalypse, right? It's really kind of a reset back to the status quo. The only real exception here is that Deathstroke, because of everything that had gone on, when the Great Darkness was pushed out of its body, it took all of his powers with it. So the guy has no healing factor or anything. He's just a guy. He's in constant pain all the time, but he's just a dude out there. Now, this is where things get wild, and this is the point that I was making to you guys. So what Mr. Terrific does is, as he's sitting around and talking to everybody, that Mr. Terrific asks Zatanna, right, just one of the more powerful magic wielders in DC Comics, and who's pretty knowledgeable about the multiverse, he asks her, what did you find? And she says, the Great Darkness continues to rest, quiet again and unconcerned with us. It proves that Pariah's machine allowed him to tap into just a fraction of the darkness's true powers. And so that's when Hal Jordan asked, so Pariah was never connected to the Great Darkness, it was all in his head. The response of Hawkgirl is, what do we tell people that happened here? And Barry basically says nothing, right? They can believe it was the Great Darkness if that will help ease their worries. Now, this is an exceedingly important point to make. And the reason why is because what this means is all the things that we saw Pariah do, bringing back the multiverse and all that kind of stuff, that was simply just a small infinitesimal portion of the Great Darkness's abilities. That if Pariah was truly channeling the full power of the Great Darkness, everybody would have died like that. They would have died instantaneously. There's nothing they would have been able to do because the Great Darkness's power is so extreme. Now, I love that Joshua Williamson threw this in here. And the reason why is because for anybody who knows anything about the Great Darkness, the biggest question they found themselves asking here is, how in the world is any of this reconciled, right? Like, how in the world can the Great Darkness be used by somebody and not just obliterate everything in existence instantaneously, right? How can the Great Darkness be so astronomically powerful that it stands as the equal in power but the opposite of God? and in turn have to kind of go through all these steps and this great big huge long story arc and all these processes just to infect and spread into the dark multiverse, or into the multiverse itself. The response of Joshua Williamson is because Pariah wasn't really using any real measure of the Great Darkness's power. He was using a little bit of it, but not the full totality of it, which really begs the question, what would things have looked like if Pariah really was channeling the power of the Great Darkness in its full totality? And so following this is kind of the last tidbit of the story. What you do is you switch over to Dick Grayson and Batman. And the reason why is because as the two of them are here, Dick Grayson kind of presents Batman with this candle. Now, for those of you guys who remembered in the death of the Justice League, Dick Grayson had a candle in his hand that he had basically, and everybody else had a candle as well, right? Like a giant candlelight vigil. For everybody else who was there, it was a vigil honoring the memories of the Justice League, right? All their great deeds and the things that they had done and so on and so forth. For Dick Grayson, the candle in particular represented hope. And the reason why is because when Bruce Wayne had taken Dick Grayson under his wing and trained him to become Robin, it didn't happen immediately. Instead, Dick Grayson was just the adopted son of Bruce Wayne. Eventually, Bruce Wayne revealed the truth to Dick Grayson, and when that happened, he and Dick Grayson made a vow, right? The Robin's vow, the vow that Dick made when he became Robin. That moment with that candle signified hope. It signified that there was a future for Dick Grayson outside of his family having died, that he could actually live a life. He could have some meaning, right? The death of his family could have some meaning in this world. And that's what's so intriguing, is because Dick Grayson presents it to Batman, and Batman in turn snaps it in half. And so where you can initially see this as a bit of an insult, instead what Batman says is, I appreciate that you kept that candle. I really, really do. And he says, after I put on the cape and cowl for the first time, I was alone on the streets of Gotham against the darkness as it tried to drown me. But that candle was never the light in the dark for me. It was you, right? You, Dick Grayson, were the one who kept me from falling down to a very dark version of myself. And you have been that light for everybody out here, for every single superhero. People can just say what they want about Superman, about him being the guy that everybody looks up to and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, he's kind of the moral guide for how we should operate as superheroes. But when it comes to us falling to our darker selves, when it comes to us giving up when we really, really want to, but in turn moving away from that desire to quit and keeping on the good path, you're the reason why we do that, Dick Grayson. Like, you're the reason. Like, you are the brightest and the best among us, right? You are the light that keeps superheroes from falling to the dark. It's a very, very beautiful and touching speech that Bruce Wayne gives to Dick Grayson. And so following this, what Bruce says is that there is no Justice League now. That yes, the Justice League was quote unquote technically killed, albeit Dick Grayson never truly believed it. He's like, but the Justice League was, you could call it, disbanded for a period of time. And that led to Dick Grayson and Jonathan Kent forming their own superhero teams respectively and so on. But what Bruce says is that while the members of the Justice League did come back, and while they all did face off against Pariah and then Slade and the day was saved, the League is not officially reformed. And the reason why is, he says, at the end of the day, after all we've been through, the League felt we needed time to rethink the Justice League as a team. It needs more than just new members. It needs to find a new mission. It needs to find a new legacy. I.e., this is DC Comics saying the Justice League will return, but it'll be different. Because we're basically going to rework how the team roster functions and why individual members were picked for that team. We have to craft a story around it, yada, yada, yada. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.